From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to a special 2-hour edition of Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We have some big stories today, including in Georgia as well as up on Capitol Hill. But in the meantime, President Trump has just come out on a stage overlooking the south face of the White House, overlooking the south portico there, and he is about to speak. We're going to listen to a little bit of what he has to say. This is the President of the United States. He is speaking, but we do not have the audio. I apologize to our audience. We do not have the audience. He is trying to speak, but we are not listening. We'll bring you a little bit as things develop. In the meantime, let's go to those other two main stories. Number one, the counting of the electoral votes in the Congress, scheduled to begin an hour from now, and the aftermath of the Georgia runoff elections from yesterday. On the Georgia Senate races, we turn now to our colleague Emily Wilkins, who has been on the scene throughout this historic runoff. So, Emily, it's a particularly timely time to come to you because we saw some headlines cross that actually one Georgia official indicates that perhaps the second race may also have been resolved, although no one has called the second race. Give us a sense of where we are right now.
That's absolutely right, David. We don't have a call yet on the Ossoff Purdue race. Right now, Ossoff is about 17,000 votes ahead of Purdue, but there's been a lot of confidence because the areas of Georgia that we still need to count the ballots in are very Democratic areas, and so people are expecting Ossoff to actually continue to get more votes and continue to widen his gap between himself and Purdue. The other race, Raphael Warnock and Kelly Loeffler, that was called for Warnock last night. He gave a brief speech in which he accepted victory, said that and called for bipartisanship.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt us just for a moment, Emily. Thank you. We'll come back to you. But in the meantime, President Trump is speaking. We have the audio now.
It is the biggest problem we have as far as I'm concerned. Single biggest problem. The fake news and the big tech. Big tech is now coming into their own. We beat them 4 years ago. We surprised them. We took them by surprise. And this year, they rigged an election. They rigged it like they've never rigged an election before. And by the way, last night they didn't do a bad job either, if you notice. I'm honest, and I want to thank you. It's just a great honor to have this kind of crowd and to be before you and hundreds of thousands of American patriots who are committed to the honesty of our elections and the integrity of our glorious republic. All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
We've been listening to President Trump as he speaks to a crowd there on the portico outside, just outside the south wing of the White House. He's repeating his claim that, in fact, the election was stolen from him. I think it bears repeating that thus far there is no evidence of that at all. Court after court has ruled that there's no evidence of it. Election official after election official, both Republicans and Democrats, have said there's no evidence. But the president insists it was stolen, even as they're about to start counting the electoral votes up on Capitol Hill. Let's come back to Emily Wilkins, though, now. Emily, sorry for the interruption there. We wanted to listen to a little bit of what President Trump had to say. You were talking about the margins on these two races. And the margins, as I understand it, is quite important because according to Georgia rules, you have to be within, I think, 0.5% in order to ask for a recount.
That's exactly correct. And right now we've seen for Warnock and Loeffler, it seems like that race might not fall within that 0.5%. Of course, still votes to be counted there. It seems much more likely that the Ossoff-Purdue race might fall within that margin. And we did see Purdue come out last night in a statement and said that he would use any legal recourse available to make sure that all votes in Georgia were legally counted. So we might wind up seeing a bit of a recount in that particular race.
Okay, thank you so much for all your great reporting on this very historic runoff elections. That's Emily Wilkins, our colleague in Georgia. For a broader perspective on both of our major stories, we welcome back now our political contributor, Jeannie Zaino. She's professor of political science at Iona College. So, Jeannie, first, let's start with the Electoral College, because there will be about an hour from now, they're going to start going through the roll call of the states. Is there any question about what the ultimate result will be, even if we don't know exactly when it will happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that the ultimate result is going to be Joe Biden is going to be certified. And the reason is that the Democrats control the House. And so they will obviously support Joe Biden, and this will be over. The question is, how much does this gin up frustration? fears of violence and demonstrations and those kinds of things in D.C. and elsewhere, and perpetuate what we were just listening to, which is the president making these, unsubstantiated claims, blaming fake news, big tech, progressive Democrats for stealing the election, when, as you mentioned, there's been no solid evidence of election stealing and over 60 lawsuits, and no judges have supported those the cases that have been brought forward. So I think that's the big question. And also it does speak, I think, to the division in the Republican Party. And one of the questions in my mind is, given what happened in Georgia last night that you and Emily were just talking about, do Republicans rethink following, or at least some Republicans rethink following the president down this really, really perilous path of challenging elections without evidence to no avail, because they can't win this fight, as Mitch McConnell has made clear.
One thing that I haven't seen too much talk about, Jeannie, and you would know about this as a political science professor, is there a danger for the Republicans that if they challenge the Electoral College process too vigorously, there may be a move to actually do away with it, which would not benefit, as I understand it, the Republicans ultimately in future races?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've heard a lot about that because the election was so close. But as you remember, it's so recent. But as you remember, post 2000, we did hear a lot of discussion about, quote unquote, doing away with the Electoral College. Awfully difficult in my mind to imagine we would get an amendment passed in this environment, but there are ways to essentially make the Electoral College sort of skirt around it so that the popular vote prevails. And there's been a movement for several years to that end, and that movement is not far off achieving its goals. So I think if they push this too far, to your point, in the next few years, we could see that come to fruition. Again, I'm not suggesting we'd see a constitutional amendment, but there is a pathway to do this and have the votes, have the states agree by legislation to follow the popular vote regardless of what the Electoral College is. And that's something we could see happen in the next few years if this continues.
So Jeannie, we don't have a call in the second race. So we want to emphasize that, although it appears to be heading in a Democratic direction. If, in fact, the Democrats take both seats, you and I have been talking about how much of a difference that really would make in terms of future initiatives. We've seen Chuck Schumer, just within the last few minutes, say that the first thing on their agenda is $2,000 direct payments to individuals. How realistic is that?
I think that is something that's realistic, in part thanks to the president, the current president, President Trump, who came out and supported that, and we've seen some Republicans go along with that. So I think that is something we could see happen. My view is that we're going to, if the Democrats, again, if they take the Senate, we're going to see them with the ability to confirm nominees, judges, cabinet members. We're going to see them able to pass budget reconciliation, control committees. And so things like the $2,000 stimulus, that I think we'll see. I don't think we're going to see an ability to move on any sort of big progressive agenda item like Medicare for All, which the President-elect Biden didn't even run on, the Green New Deal, or things like that. I think those are just too big to get through. But for Biden's moderate agenda, I think some of that has obviously much better chance of passing with Democrats in control. So I think in the first year or so, we're going to see him be able to move on some of that.
So maybe not a lot of big progressive legislation, but what about appointments? What about personnel, particularly as we have some cabinet nominees that we have not heard yet? For example, Attorney General. If, in fact, President-elect Biden believes he has the votes in the Senate, might that free him up to put more progressive candidates into the cabinet?
Absolutely, and I think that's the kind of thing where we were just talking about why has he waited on the Attorney General, and I think one of the reasons may be to see if they indeed do, Democrats take the Senate, he'd have more wiggle room to appoint somebody perhaps a little bit more progressive. I think those kinds of reasons sort of explain what's going on with that. And I do think he will enjoy that because you can do that by a majority. And certainly if he's got the 51, he'll be able to do that. And at this point, one of the questions I'm hearing is he going to be able to pull over some moderate Republicans who are really frustrated with President Trump and the Republican Party, given what's been going on in the last few months?
Fascinating. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure covering this entire thing with you. That's Jeannie Zaino, our Bloomberg political contributor. Markets have been moving, and for a while I thought it was clearly because of Georgia. I'm not sure so much, but to answer that for us, we have Kaylee Lyons. Kaylee, what is going on?
David, I do think it has a lot to do with Georgia. This is a market that now has to confront the fact that it must reprice a blue wave. Whether or not that second Senate race has been called, that is what the market is pricing at this point, repricing its previous expectations of a divided government. And as this session has grown older, it seems to be getting more and more comfortable with that idea. Maybe everyone is remembering back in October when the consensus call was a blue sweep is the best case scenario because it would bring more stimulus. Where we're shaking out right now, the S&P 500 is around the highs of the session, up more than 1%. Tech is still the relative laggard here. On the flip side of the blue sweep coin, you have concerns about higher corporate taxes, more regulation when it comes to some of the big players. So the NASDAQ 100 is still in the red by about 0.1%. Where your outperformance is coming from is the more cyclically sensitive areas of the market that would benefit most from more stimulus and more growth. The Russell 2000 at a fresh record high. It is rallying more than 4% today, as are the financials. Really, banks the big driver to here. Far and away the best performers within the S&P 500, and that is in large part thanks to the steeper curve. We are seeing a steeper curve today. Yields moving higher. The 10-year yield here in the U.S. is above 1% again, David. It has not reached that resistance level since all the way back in March. It's climbing 10 basis points today, right around, it's about 10 basis points higher than it was at the beginning of March. At this point right now, sitting around 1.03%. Again, that is all about the reflation trade. The idea being Democratic control will bring larger fiscal stimulus that will bring more inflation and more growth. We've already seen that reflected in break-even rates. The 10-year rate now above 2%, and it's starting, nominal yields are starting to catch up, though at 1%, we still have a way to go. Still, though, a big milestone that we've reached today with that 1% level, David.
Yeah, we've been talking about it for some time. It is a big milestone. Thank you so much to Kayla Lyons for that report on the markets. Coming up, John Hope Bryant of Operation Hope joins us on what the election means for the less fortunate among us. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump is turning up the pressure on his vice president in his last-ditch effort to overturn his loss in the November election. Vice President Mike Pence is presiding today over a joint session of lawmakers for the congressional tallying of electoral votes. On Twitter, Mr. Trump repeated his unfounded claims of election fraud and urged Mr. Pence to, quote, send them back to the states and we win, something the vice president does not have the power to do. Addressing supporters at this hour, the president said, quote, we will never concede, end quote. Democrats are on the verge of taking control of the U.S. Senate. Raphael Warnock defeated incumbent Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler to win one of the two seats in the Georgia runoff election. He would be the state's first African-American senator. Meanwhile, Democrat John Ossoff's race against incumbent David Purdue is too close to call. Still, Ossoff has a 16,000-vote lead and has claimed victory. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is promising that England's schools will be the first things to reopen under the national lockdown. But Prime Minister Johnson warned the return to normal may still be months away. Speaking in Parliament in an emergency debate on the coronavirus pandemic, the Prime Minister also said the country is ramping up its vaccination efforts. There are nearly 1,000 vaccination centers open around the UK. So far, so good. That assessment today from Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey. The comments were Bailey's first since the Brexit transition period ended. He told the Parliament committee that financial stability risks have mostly been mitigated. Bailey also said that finance job losses from Brexit may be less than speculated, estimating that 5,000 positions have migrated to the EU so far. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. And there's been breaking news on the Bloomberg, even as Mark was talking. There are now reports from both the Associated Press and Politico that Merrick Garland will be the choice by President-elect Biden for his Attorney General. Merrick Garland, of course, of the D.C. Circuit, and he had been nominated for the Supreme Court. His nomination was held off by the Republicans at the end of the Obama administration, but the reports now are that Merrick Garland will be the choice by President-elect Biden. We will bring you more on that story as it develops. We want to turn back to Georgia right now. By all accounts, black voters and other people of color turned out in record numbers for yesterday's runoff elections in Georgia, after a year when issues of racial and economic justice have been very much in the forefront. For nearly 30 years, John Hope Bryant has been working with those less fortunate to promote equal opportunity through economic empowerment. And we welcome now the founder, chairman, and CEO of Operation Hope. He is John Hope Bryant. So thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. You have a particular perspective on what's gone on in Georgia, as well as the larger election. We know that a lot of the people less fortunate have been hit the hardest by the pandemic and the economic aftermath. Did that really drive this election?
No, actually, that was not the primary driver of this election. And by the way, David, thanks for all you do, and thanks for having me. Black America votes in mass as a group, basically twice. When we're super proud, i.e. the first election of President Barack Obama, or when we're super pissed. I think that we felt massively disrespected by some of our national leadership in the last 4 years. Really felt dehumanized. And given the history of this country, where one could argue the largest reverse transfer of wealth happened with African Americans building the core of this country's wealth in the 16, 17, 1800s with slavery and free labor. And we couldn't create capital because we were capital. We thought that was a particular disrespect, the lack of empathy, of understanding the role that we played, and the role of public officials to care after the least of these God's children, which, by the way, often become the primary assets. You know, Sam Walton had a high school education, as you know, David, but is now responsible for the largest retailer in the world. That's what happens when you invest at the bottom of the pyramid. So I think that you had people turn out en masse because they felt they were given, I can't say on your program, but they were given a massive disrespect by some of our elected officials, and we wanted to send a message. And I think we've done that brilliantly. Something else is very interesting, David. The place where in the 60s you had Dr. King leading a movement of social justice, which was backed by primarily African Americans and Jewish brothers and sisters, now has a U.S. senator from that same place. That's an African American and one of our Jewish brothers. And it was a coalition of the willing. Yes, blacks were decisive in the presidential election and this one, but we couldn't have done it alone. You have really all races who said, knock it off, America. It's time to get back to business. And let's make America normal again. But let's rebuild her with the best of her bones, which include all of her economic levers in place.
But John, if I can interrupt you, you make a very important point, but there's a distinction there. Making America normal again, in some respects, will not do it. As you point out, there's 400 years now of basically building America on the backs of people who were not equally treated, who did not have the ability to earn the money and amass the capital. What realistically can the black community expect from a President Biden when he takes over to start to change that phenomenon?
Well, and by the way, it's interesting that Reverend Warnock, who had Operation Hope's award in the background when you did his acceptance speech, we noted that he actually asked me to put a Hope Inside location at Ebenezer Church, Dr. King's church, about 8 years ago. And so this concept of civil rights and civil rights, that the real color is green, and that we need to provide social justice through economic empowerment, through home ownership and small business creation, wealth creation, is something not foreign to Reverend Warnock. And I think you'll start to see a moderation of him, a moderating leadership from him that I think most people will appreciate. I think likewise, and I've been contacted by the Biden administration transition team, you're going to see, I think, a focus on small business, which is the right place to start. That's where most wealth creation from my white counterparts came from. And there's almost was it $98 trillion, I believe is the number, of my white counterparts. They own 90% of all equities and all wealth in this country. That comes a lot from small business. That's where jobs come from. 53% of all jobs in this country are employers with 50 employees or less. Conversely, half of black businesses were sidelined in the coronavirus, 41%. And 96% of all black businesses, as you know, David, don't have an employee. I'm gonna repeat that. 96% of all black businesses in this country are sole proprietorships with no employees. So how do you create wealth? How do you create jobs when you don't have the mechanism to do so? So I think you're gonna see a massive focus on not just some raw stimulus. That's not enough. That is actually can be negative if that's all you do. You have to turn the stimulus into an investment. You're going to see that in, I think, small business, and I think you're going to see it in massive internship programs. I'm talking about millions of internships, not hundreds of thousands.
So there you're talking about private sector as well as public sector. And we have seen some big private companies start to do some of that investment, particularly in the financial services area, which you know so terribly well.
Yeah, once again, it was the private sector, David, in the 1960s that led the effort to desegregate the South because it was bad for business. Very few people know this, but it was not the government that integrated the South. The governor was standing in the door saying, "Over my dead body," oftentimes sounding like what some of our federal leaderships are sounding like today. It was the private sector who said, "Knock it off. This is bad for business. Whether you're black or white, we need some more green. Let's take down the whites only signs from the soda shops, the department stores, et cetera. Let's integrate these places where blacks are coming in to buy." It was the private sector. Once again, David, you have the private sector that's made a $300 billion investment in 2020 alone on social justice through economic empowerment. Companies like Shopify, where I partnered with to create 1 million black businesses, companies like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, PayPal, all these companies, Twitter, et cetera, who've stepped up into this gap. I think the private sector, 90% of our jobs, David, as you know, come from the private sector. Most legitimate wealth comes from the private sector. The fortune here is at the bottom of this pyramid, and the private sector understands they can't get there without black and brown customers. Diverse companies and diverse geographies win. That is a fact. I like math because it does not have an opinion. That is just a winning formula, and the government needs to follow that lead. So the government should be the stimulus for the private sector. I'm talking about massive internships, David. Right. Massive. I'm talking about millions of young people who know that they can, the ladder is repaired, including my white brothers and sisters, by the way, to get that opportunity for the future.
Yeah, it's fascinating, John. Every time we have you on, you open my eyes some. We need to have you back because I really want to go through what you think, as a practical matter, this administration can do. Does this make the small business administration administrator a critical position in the Biden administration?
I do believe it does. It's been a titular member of the cabinet in the past, but I believe now small business has proven in the pandemic to be what you and I've always known, the backbone of this economy and of jobs. And I think that's going to get special recognition in the next couple of years. I think that people are going to be pleasantly surprised. I think you're seeing it in the way the markets are responding. You're seeing. I had a billionaire friend of mine this morning text me and say, "Well, I guess my taxes are going up for good reason." I mean, so he was like, "Look, I don't mind if they go up. If we're talking about social justice through economic empowerment and uplift and smart taxation, where all boats rise. You're going to have more GDP, more economic opportunity."
So, John, I don't want to let you go without getting an initial reaction to these reports. Now we're seeing that Merrick Garland may well be the nominee for the Attorney General. Do you have a reaction to that?
I don't, but I just trust this administration. I trust that President Biden is not trying to get a second term. I think he wants to rebalance this, to bring some dignity and some reasonableness back. That's his legacy, I believe. And I think you'll see a very an inclusive government. I would not be surprised if you start to see, after he checks the diversity box, he starts reaching across the aisle in a more in an even bolder way. I'm very hopeful for the next couple of years, David. Rainbows only follow storms. You cannot have a rainbow without a storm first. And it's time for a rainbow. We're exhausted by the storm.
I love that. Rainbows only follow storms. I'm going to remember that and use it from time to time. Thank you so much. As I say, it's always a great pleasure to have you with us. That's John Hope Bryant, Operation Hope Chairman and CEO, as well as founder. We'll have more on Merrick Garland coming up next. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Western. We want to pursue that breaking news. Reports out of the Associated Press and Politico say that President-elect Biden will nominate Merrick Garland as Attorney General. We turn now to our colleague, Bloomberg's Larry Liebert in Washington. So, Larry, Merrick Garland, of course, is well known to the public at this point because he has been in the D.C. circuit. He was nominated to the Supreme Court, and the Republicans refused to take up his nomination at the end of the Obama administration. What do we know about Judge Garland?
Well, first of all, as you say, it's rich in poetic justice. He was on the list for Joe Biden throughout, but it's clear that Biden waited until he was confident that he would have a Democratic Senate, and he picked, though a moderate, he picked someone who had universal support in Congress when he was up for the appeals court, but was blocked by Mitch McConnell. So there's that irony. He is widely respected, and he will serve a unique role because after President Trump's often criticized relationship with Bill Barr, he will come in with Biden pledging publicly, repeatedly, that he will leave his attorney general to run the Justice Department. He won't interfere, and that includes on pending matters like the investigation into the president-elect's son, Hunter. But here you have a fellow with a very temperate style, a distinguished track record, and as you know, David, since I understand you do know him, here's a guy who's giving up the security of a lifetime appointment on the appeals court for a position that's going to be fraught with complexities and political pressures on all sides.
Yeah, I did know him quite well. We clerked together on the Second Circuit. He for Judge Friendly, a very distinguished judge, and then he clerked for Justice Brennan when I was at the Supreme Court with Justice Powell. So I have known him in an earlier stage of his career. But I want to pick up on one thing you said, Larry. President-elect Biden has said he wants an independent attorney general. If he wanted that, he's got somebody like that in Merrick Garland because, as you suggest, he's had a full and distinguished career. He doesn't need this job at all. He's got his place in the history books already. And so he is somebody who I would expect would tell the president exactly what was the truth.
Yeah, there are also there were other candidates who might cause more of a stir among support among liberals, including Sally Yates, who was a senior official who stood up to President Trump in when he began his term, and she didn't get the nod. Doug Jones, who lost the Senate seat, he probably would have been easily confirmable even with a Republican Senate, or at least confirmable. But instead, Biden went with someone who, again, has this poetic justice going that Democrats will appreciate, but has a track record that will be hard. Yeah. They'll try, but it will be hard for Republicans to assail.
Larry, thank you so much for joining us on this breaking news. That is Bloomberg's Larry Liebert from Washington. I want to turn back to Capitol Hill now. A short time from now, the Senate will join the House of Representatives in the House chamber for a tally of the Electoral College votes, with a group of Republicans saying that they are going to object to the reported votes from several states, including that of Michigan. Welcome now one of those who will participate in that debate. He is Representative Dan Kildee of Michigan, a member of the Democratic leadership as Chief Deputy Whip. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. Give us your sense of what you anticipate will happen starting at 1 o'clock Eastern time here.
Well, there is some uncertainty. We know that we will begin the process the way we have each year for 2 centuries, with the Vice President opening the ballots and beginning the tabulation process. At that point, members of the House and Senate have the opportunity to object. We don't know which states precisely will have objections raised. Michigan is one of the 6 that have been indicated by some Republican members. I shouldn't say Republicans, because this is clearly not a partisan question. And we'll get into that in a moment, I suppose. But some members of the House or Senate will object. And at that point, we'll begin the debate on each of those objections as they come up. We are prepared, our Michigan delegation, we are prepared to defend our Electoral College votes. We've been working on this for the last few days. But we don't know yet whether our state will be one that they ultimately determine to object to, because, of course, in every case, the evidence is thin. In our case, it's a particularly thin argument that they're making.
Well, and the evidence has been gone over by court after court after court, as I understand it, and no court really has found there to be real evidence of fraud in any sense. You're a Democrat, not a Republican, but what do you make of what's going on across the aisle there? Because as you look at the people, they're coming down in very different positions among the Democrats themselves, and it doesn't, at least to my eye, break down according to supposedly conservative versus moderate.
It's not conservative versus moderate, and it's not Democrats versus Republicans. It's a small subset that happen to be Republicans, but clearly not all of them, who have decided that their willingness to pander to a whipped-up Trump base is stronger than their commitment to the oath that they swore to the Constitution. And I think that's really what's happening here. President Trump is whipping up his base for his own purposes, either to assuage his ego, maybe he really believes they can overturn the results, who knows? I mean, he has certain sociopathic tendencies, it's hard to tell what he really believes. But one thing that is the most cynical aspect of this whole thing is that many of those senators and representatives, many of whom I've spoken to, know that there's no truth to these allegations, and they simply say, I can't resist the base. I'm getting so many calls. That is such an abdication of the public responsibility that they swore an oath to that it's hard for me to put into words. And I have to say this, I will look at all of those who vote to sustain these challenges when they know that there's no factual basis. I will look at them differently, and so will the history of this country.
Well, as you say, it is history, and so it bears some attention without a doubt, but by all accounts, nobody expects that it's going to affect the fact that Joe Biden will be inaugurated as our next president come January 20. So let's move forward into a world with Joe Biden in the White House as our president, and we have, it looks like, increasing the likelihood of a 50-50 split in the Senate. What can the Democrats do? What would be on your agenda as part of the leadership of the Democratic caucus up in the House? What realistically can you get accomplished?
I think a couple of things. And first and foremost, we'll be taking the necessary steps to crush this virus and to make sure that American businesses and American families are still standing as we go through this. And there's much more to do in that regard. We saw that over the last several months. We won't have Mitch McConnell or Donald Trump in the way, and that will give us a chance to get things done that we otherwise haven't been able to. But I think in the bigger and long-term picture, I would suggest looking very seriously at an infrastructure investment initiative that would span a decade, that would both have the effect of stimulating the economy, providing some confidence that there will be an economy that is strong, but also rebuilding America's roads and bridges and rails, and as you and I know, water systems from places like Flint. That will have a positive benefit, and I think it's something that goes well beyond typical partisan divisions. There are other things we'll want to do that might be more partisan, but if we start with COVID, crushing the virus, and then move into something like infrastructure, I think we have a chance to get something done that will not take us down that typical partisan division.
When it comes to COVID, does that translate into more fiscal stimulus? We had the minority leader, beg your pardon, Chuck Schumer today say that he thinks the first priority should be $2,000 to every household. Does that make sense to you?
I think it does. That's one aspect of it. I think we also want to make sure that we're supporting state and local governments that have really been hurt and will not be able to provide the essential public services absent some support. I also think that the president's role has to be to immediately get control of the vaccination process. I mean, we have to give President Trump and his team some credit for developing the vaccine. We'll give them credit where credit's due. We all participated in that, and he's one of them. But where he has, again, completely failed is having absolutely no plan for the distribution of the vaccine itself. And that's something that President Biden and Vice President Harris, I know, are going to have very much at the beginning of their agenda.
And President Biden has said that's his number one priority is addressing the virus. Makes very good sense. At the same time, says he wants to go ahead and build back better. Let's talk about that infrastructure just for a moment. This has been talked about a lot by Democrats and Republicans. Do you have in your mind a price tag on that? How big are we talking about?
Well, if we listen to the American Society of Civil Engineers, the experts, they say we have about a $4.3 trillion infrastructure deficit. In other words, that's the price tag to get us to the point where we have 21st century infrastructure. So what we should do is bite off as much of that as we can get political agreement for and that we can reasonably finance. I think it will be in the trillions. I don't know if we can get to that $4.3 trillion number. It's a moving target, but we ought to do as much of that as we possibly can. And what I'll be pushing for is the most aggressive approach that will be a 10 to 15 year initiative that will allow us to not only grow our economy, but to build back better and be stronger and be more competitive in this increasingly competitive global economy.
Congressman, it's always such a pleasure to have you with us. As you say, we're both from Michigan, from Flint, actually, Michigan. That's Congressman Dan Kildee. He's Democrat from Michigan. Coming up, David Zaslav, CEO of Discovery, will take us through his new streaming service, Discovery Plus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Streaming video seems to be taking over the media world, and the latest major contender comes from Discovery. Discovery Plus launched on Monday with more than 55,000 episodes, and it's already the second most popular streaming service on Verizon's App Store. We welcome now the president and CEO of Discovery, David Zaslav. David, thank you so much for being with us. There's a lot of other things I could say. There's some very favorable reviews, and I know you don't pay any attention to your stock price, but you're up about 7.5% right now. I think the highest since 2015. So give us a sense of why you're different from the ones who've come before.
First, thanks. It's good to see you, David. We've been working at this for about 5 years to aggregate the right IP and to build a strategy to transform Discovery from a cable and free-to-air company to a global IP company. It's the reason we did the Scripps deal. We thought that Food and HG were global IP products where we own all of it. It's the reason that we did a very big deal with the BBC to own all their entire science and natural history library, including Planet Earth and Blue Planet. It's why we did the deal with Oprah and why we did Chip and Joanna Gaines. So we looked at the marketplace and we saw how effective Netflix was as a global power. And Disney now has become, the two of them, two global powers that can reach most consumers anywhere in the world, or over time they will. But they're scripted series and scripted movies. And there's 7 other people trying to be like them and competing with them. But if you look at how people watch television, about 45% of what they watch is scripted series and scripted movies. But the other 50 or 55% is us. It's Oprah, it's Chip and Jo, it's the Property Brothers, it's Discovery, it's Planet Earth, it's Food. And so we have been quietly aggregating all that content here in the U.S. We did a deal with History and A&E and Lifetime and aggregated theirs. For the last few years, we've been doing original content. And we came to the market with Verizon as our partner, with Hans and Ronan and the whole Verizon team. They are going to be driving us to the 50 million Verizon homes. We also follow Disney's lead in that we're the only other global platform. So it's Netflix, Disney, and us. And we're on every platform. This week we announced we're on Roku and Amazon and Samsung. And so we're ubiquitous. We're instead of being one of 7 or one of 8 in scripted series and scripted movies, we're one of 1. We're really unique. We have great brands and great characters, and we're off to a great start. We're feeling, really confident as a global IP company.
David, you told me in the past, as a leader, one of the things that you have learned is that the strategy never stays static, that it's never what you start out with. It evolves over time. You respond to various phenomena. How is the strategy for you in streaming today different than it would have been a year ago, as you've gotten to see things like Disney Plus come out and also some other significant streaming services? How has it changed?
We've always seen that we don't believe you can compete unless you're global. The idea of building a product and being U.S. only, even though the U.S. is 330 million homes, we always felt that we need to be global and we need to own all of our content. So that piece we've been aggregating for the last 5 years and producing. That's how we emerged with 1,000 hours of original content on this product. But what we did learn watching Disney, and Chapek and Iger have been very effective, is that clarity of what you are really matters. If every time you see the Disney brand, you then see Pixar, Star Wars, Disney Family, and it's very clear that from a curation perspective, when you look at Disney, they let you know exactly what it is. They're not saying watch a show. They're saying we're a great home if you love these brands. And there was a lot of talk of brands going away. Brands have never been more important, and great characters that people love, we believe, have never been so important because it's hard to curate. Everyone's asking, what should I watch? What should I do? When you go to Disney, it's pretty easy. You could say, I love Marvel, so I'm going to go hang around in that world. And so we've really driven very hard into that, which is our core DNA anyway. But when people come to us, they see, if you love HG or food or Chip and Joanna Gaines or Discovery and Planet Earth or crime is a huge genre for us, that people are very familiar with those brands, and whether it's Martha or Oprah, the characters that we have, Mike Rowe. So we think we have something very unique, but we did lean harder into the characters and the brands. And we also saw that we need more original content. And that's why we launched with over 50 original series, because a lot of exclusivity. The only place to get Chip and Jo is on Discovery Plus. Most of the 90-day library, which is the #1 show on television and a great young demographic, is on Discovery Plus with over 150 hours of original content and new 90-day content every week. So the idea is, yes, we have a library as big or bigger than Netflix, but we need original content and we need to go forward with the great brands and characters. And the other thing that I think we're really lucky with is we come at a moment now, we're like just at the right moment to launch. Disney has been really successful globally, so is Netflix, but part of that was introducing people to how do you buy a product like this? How do you move it from device to device? Getting used to viewing and buying a product. And as we hit January, a lot of these great services, people have watched a lot of the content on there. So we emerge now with a fresh library, as big as Netflix, that has never been offered before in terms of being everything we have, as well as all this original at a time when, because of people are going to be home for the next 3 months, and because a lot of the other services haven't been able to produce, we're not just differentiated, but we're fresh. And I think that's one of the things that has been exciting for consumers. So we feel like we're in a great position here in the U.S. and outside the U.S. We already launched with Sky.
Right.
We have Verizon pushing us here. We have Sky, and we have Vodafone pushing us over the next year across Europe.
Right.
So we have great direct-to-consumer companies that love our product and believe that we could help them grow.
Which raises the question, in my mind at least, we all know how to buy these. How many of them are we going to buy? And in the end, how many major services will it be? You were there in the room creating MSNBC and CNBC, some of the great cable channels. As you go forward in the future, how many streaming services is the average American, or that, for that matter, European or person around the world, going to subscribe to?
Look, there's 7, 8, 9, 10 players trying to be in the scripted series, scripted movie business. Very difficult. You already have 2 guys with 150, 200 million homes. A lot of them aren't going to make it. And from a curation perspective, consumers, it's just too confusing to have 14 different. The great thing that we think is that we go really well with Disney. If you have Disney, you're going to want us as a companion. If you have Netflix and Disney, you're going to want us. If you have HBO and Disney, you're going to want us because we're different. So we're a great companion to those guys. And we do think there'll be a willowing out. A lot of them won't make it because they're competing with each other and they have the same proposition. But we are also a great companion, and we're differentiated in, as great as The Crown is, you watch it with your family at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. We have great content like 90 Day and Chip and Jo and Oprah that's appointment viewing. But a lot of our content is a great companion. As people are home for 3 months, they could watch food and HG and crime content while they're doing homework, while they're on Zoom calls in the background, while they're cooking. And so we think we're a great companion to people around the world. And these other services really aren't that. And we think we, as a bundle, when you put us together with those other services, we really fill it out. And outside the U.S., our strategy also is one of one. We're local content, local entertainment, local sport. Yeah. And so when Disney and Netflix come into Poland, or when they come into Northern Europe, in those markets, we have 40% share, and we're the majority player in sports. So we think being differentiated and one of one, we're not taking on Netflix and Disney.
Right.
We want to go with them.
Right. As long as we don't lose Shark Week. That's the only thing that most people are concerned about. Thank you so much, Discovery CEO David Zaslav. Congratulations on the launch of Discovery Plus. Coming up, we're going to talk with Sam Palmisano, former head of IBM, about how the election is affecting tech and what the incoming Biden administration needs to do about cyber security. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're beginning to see some reactions in the equity markets to yesterday's Georgia elections, with different sectors affected in different ways. To give us a snapshot, we welcome now Emma Chandra. Emma?
Thanks very much, David. It is a case of what is hot and what is not today, David. Big moves at either end of the red and green spectrum. Let's start with what is not doing well today, and that is technology. The NASDAQ 100 firmly in the red, and it's the big names, those trillion-dollar names that are doing particularly poorly. The likes of Apple, Google, Amazon, all down close to 3% at the lows of the session. They have clawed back a little since then. Look at that, Apple down now around 0.7%. The concern, of course, though, is that these companies will face greater scrutiny, greater regulation as we look at where the possibility now, or the more certain possibility, of a united government. Of course, they would also be impacted by any changes to corporation tax, to capital gains. Also, some of the new age tech, the likes of Zoom, look at that, down some 3% today, getting caught in the downdraft. Let's flip now to what is doing particularly well, and I want to mention financials, following their European cousins to a sizzling rally today. JP Morgan up the most since February. Morgan Stanley, the highest ever. Now, of course, the reflation trade seeming to be firmly back on. We saw the 10-year yield rise above 1%, and it's still up there for the first time in some 10 months. Finally, I wanted to mention some other cyclicals doing well. The likes of the infrastructure stocks, they're doing particularly well. Caterpillar on a 5-day winning streak. It's risen some 10% in that time. Also, Martin Marietta up 7%. They make asphalt and gravel to go into buildings and into roads. Of course, the expectation that a Biden administration and Democrat Congress could finally get an infrastructure deal. Though I'm pretty sure we talked about that 4 years ago, David.
Yeah, and again and again and again. That's right, Emma. Thank you so much to Emma Chandra for that report on the various sectors in the equity markets. Coming up in our second hour of Balance of Power, we're going to head to Capitol Hill as Congress begins counting the electoral votes. We're also going to talk with the former head of IBM, Sam Palmisano, about the fallout for tech from the election, but also the ongoing crisis in cybersecurity. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to the second hour of Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. At this hour, the Senate is making its way into the House chamber for a joint session in which they will be tallying the Electoral College votes. We can see, if you're watching on TV, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House presiding, she will turn over the gavel to the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, who's the President of the Senate, to actually preside over the tallying of the votes. In the meantime, we have headlines crossing the Bloomberg right now that Vice President Pence has now said that he does not have the authority to determine electoral votes, does not have the authority. This puts to rest, perhaps, the question that has been raised in part by President Trump, saying that he is counting on Vice President Pence to step up on his behalf. So that we will continue to follow that as it develops in the House chamber. And as they come to the point where objections are actually made, which is expected, we will do our best to bring those to you. An historic development. There will be some formalities before that, but as they get to objections, we will bring those to you. In the meantime, the drama continues down in Georgia as the remaining few thousand votes are being counted in the race between David Purdue and Jon Ossoff. For the latest, we turn again to our Bloomberg colleague, Emily Wilkins in Georgia. So, Emily, thank you so much for being with us. We know one of the races has been determined, but what about the Jon Ossoff against David Purdue? How many votes are still not counted, and do we know anything about the nature of those votes?
We're looking still at about several tens of thousand votes that have not yet been counted from a number of different counties. But what we are seeing is that the most votes that remain uncounted are coming from counties that are largely Democratic. This is something that has given Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Stacey Abrams a lot of encouragement to already go ahead and crown Jon Ossoff the next winner. Of course, we have not called that. The networks have not called that. But it looks very, very good for Ossoff at this point to become a next senator from Georgia.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily, for that great reporting throughout this historic runoff race. And right now, what we are seeing, those of you on radio, is we're seeing Vice President Pence conferring with Speaker Pelosi in the House chamber as they just begin to get the formalities underway. There's going to be some readings, some formalities to go through before they actually get to the tallying of the vote count. So the vote continues to be counted in Georgia, but it's not too late to review what we think happened yesterday. And there's no one better to do that than political pollster and strategist Frank Luntz. He is founder of Luntz Global. So, Frank, thanks for being back with us after a late night last night. Give us your take right now on what is happening down there. First of all, are you confident that, in fact, both of these seats will end up going to Democrats?
Yes, I am. And it was close. It was expected to be close, and the Republicans will regret forever their poor showing in the suburbs, that you cannot make enough of the electorate. You cannot get 50% by doing well in the rural communities and in the exurbs, that you have to get at least 15% of the vote in the urban areas and 50% of the vote in the suburbs. That's where they fell short. I think the other issue is the impact of Donald Trump, and quite frankly, his participation in that rally in northwest Georgia was significant Monday night. But if he really wanted to win those Senate seats, and one wonders whether he really wanted to win them, the idea that other Republicans could do well in places that he didn't would have bothered him. He would have spent less time on the golf course over the last 2 weeks and more time in Georgia. I think that today is day 2 of this meltdown, and I question whether there is a coherent strategy among leaders of the GOP going forward over the coming hours, days, weeks, and months.
It was said before the election that really would be a question of turnout, who turned out the vote. As you look at it right now, given the data you've seen, is this more a matter of the Democrats really raising their numbers, getting more people to turn out to vote, or the Republicans not showing up so much?
That's a great question. The answer is yes and yes. That Stacey Abrams did a fantastic job at registering voters, and then, which is what often doesn't happen, not only did she register them, but she made sure that they voted. On the Republican side, there was tremendous disillusionment, which is why David Purdue actually did worse in the second election. And normally in Georgia runoffs, the Republican adds 2, 3, 4% to their total. This time it went in the other direction. There was a majority of Republicans who voted in the Kelly Loeffler race, but this time she came up short. Republicans were disillusioned, and they were disillusioned because of the comments coming from the White House, the comments coming from the president. And look, he said he would be blamed if Republicans lost those 2 seats. Well, you know what? He understood it. He knew himself by articulating it. He knew that he would deserve it. And frankly, I think that he does.
So, Frank, you have followed so many elections, worked on many elections, many campaigns. Give us your initial sense about whether there are lessons to be learned for the longer term from this particular election, whether in November or this runoff, or was this really something of a sport because of the pandemic, because of the personality of Donald Trump? Are there things that future candidates will learn from this?
There are. And number one is you can't just run to your base. And that was what President Trump did. That's what many Republicans running in the Senate did. That's what just happened in Georgia. They made no effort to reach out to voters in the center, to voters who may have voted for Joe Biden, but did not want Democrats to be in complete control. And in my interviews with voters, I ran across a great number of them who showed up to the Biden rally and said to me that they wanted to vote for the Republican candidates, but they couldn't because of the things that Donald Trump had said and the fact that these 2 Republican senators had gone along with it and not challenged him. I believe that if they had focused on those votes in the center, they could have still turned out votes, Trumpian votes, and they would have added the number of votes in the suburbs that they would have needed. So that's number one. Don't just go to your base.
Right.
Number 2 is that you have to talk about issues that voters care about. Tax policy, budgets, criminality. And they weren't doing that either. And number three, you got to be likable.
Yeah.
And these candidates ran a campaign that just wasn't likable.
Yeah, helps to like puppies. It's been a real treat getting to work with you on this, Frank, and we hope to have you back very soon to have more. Thank you so much to Frank Luntz. He's politics and communications consultant. Coming up, we're going to be checking in on the tallying of electoral college votes in the Congress. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
To appoint or ascertain electors.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Proceedings have begun now in the House chamber on Capitol Hill with both the House and the Senate present for the counting and certification of the Electoral College votes. To take us through what is going on right now and what we can expect, we welcome now our chief Washington correspondent. He is Kevin Cirilli. Kevin?
It has begun. As if you are joining us watching on television, you are seeing pictures of Vice President Mike Pence and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, who, of course, will both be observing and monitoring and presiding over a joint session of Congress. What comes next is an alphabetical list in which every state is announced in alphabetical order, and then the House members as well as senators have the opportunity to object to those electoral college votes. In order for there to be a 2-hour debate on the floor, both a House member and a senator will have to raise objections. We are already hearing from the likes of people like Senator Ted Cruz as well as Josh Hawley, who will likely be making objections. Now, earlier this morning in Washington time, President Trump addressed a crowd of his supporters near the White House, in which he continued to place pressure on Vice President Mike Pence, who it's unknown if he will be making any remarks before certifying the Electoral College results, as he has outlined to do by the 12th Amendment in the United States Constitution.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was really terrific. Where we are right now is they have already handled the first state, which is Alabama, and they are now on Alaska, with Arizona being the first that may have an objection. That will be coming up next. And so what we want to do is actually listen to a bit of what is going on in the chamber, because we want to hear if, in fact, there is an objection to Arizona as it comes up. Vice President Pence is presiding.
This certificate from Arizona, the parliamentarians advised me, is the only certificate of vote that the state purports to be a return from the state, and that has annexed to it a certificate from an authority of that state purporting to appoint or ascertain electors.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Arizona seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Joseph R. Biden Jr. of the state of Delaware received 11 votes for president, and Kamala D. Harris of the state of California received 11 votes for vice president.
Are there any objections to counting the certificate of vote of the state of Arizona that the teller has verified appears to be regular in form and authentic?
President, I, Paul Gosar from Arizona.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
I rise up for myself and 60 of my colleagues to object to the counting of the electoral ballots from Arizona.
Is the objection in writing and signed by a senator?
Yes, it is.
It is. I need the next page. An objection presented in writing and signed by both a representative and a senator complies with the law, Chapter 1 of Title 3 of the United States Code. The clerk will report the objection.
Objection to counting the electoral votes of the state of Arizona. We, a member of the House of Representatives and a United States Senator, object to the counting of the electoral votes of the state of Arizona on the ground that they were not, under all of the known circumstances, regularly given.
Are there further objections to the certificates from the state of Arizona? The chair hears none. The two houses will withdraw from joint session. Each house will deliberate separately on the pending objection and report its decision back to the joint session. The Senate will now retire to its chamber.
We have been listening to Vice President Pence presiding over the first objection to the tally of the Electoral College. This one from Arizona. The objection was lodged by Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, a Republican. He said he spoke for 60 of his colleagues, and then the required senator supported it, and that was Senator Cruz was the supporting objector. And then, according to the Constitution and the statute, what happens now is the Senate goes back to the Senate chamber, the House stays in the House chamber, and they will have a debate over the objections in which both sides will be able to present their points of view on whether the Electoral College votes were properly lodged. They debate for up to 2 hours, and then they reconvene and report exactly what the vote was. To take us through the Constitution and the law of what we are witnessing today, we welcome now Michelle Cantor Cohen. She is senior counsel with the Fair Elections Center. So thank you so much, Michelle, for being with us. I mean, this is historic when this happens. At the same time, it's not unprecedented, right?
Right. There have been a few challenges, objections across history, but it is very rare. And I think that one of the remarkable things about this situation is that there are really no grounds on which to make these objections. The votes have been certified by the state. The voters have chosen. And this is really a political move in making these objections.
So give us a sense, as they go into the two chambers, as I understand it, there's sort of equal time, is it, between the two sides? But is that between Democrats and Republicans? Because not all Republicans are objecting.
Right. So there are a max of 2 hours of debate on the objections for each state to which an objection is made within the separate chambers. And then they need to vote a simple majority. And we know that that's not going to change the outcome here. And that is not the calculus being made by those who are objecting. They cannot change the outcome. The voters have decided. And the outcome is that voters and the Electoral College have voted to select Vice President Biden as the president-elect.
Not every objection that's been lodged in prior years has been because they want to change the result of the election. In 2005, I think Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, lodged an objection to to certifying the Ohio Electoral College votes, and she said quite specifically, it's not going to change the result, but we think that there are some irregularities that should be fixed.
Right. So it's a statement. In this situation where there has been, ample opportunity by the Trump campaign to have their case heard in the courts. I mean, they've overwhelmingly and resoundingly decided that there are not any grounds to overturn the election, that there is no evidence of problems that would change the outcome. The courts have really upheld the rule of democracy here and the rule of law. And so we know that it's about something else, right? It's not about changing the outcome. It's about maybe fundraising, politics, but it is not about the outcome here.
We talked to the Republican chairman of Cobb County, just outside of Atlanta yesterday, about challenges that he'd lodged. And he said, well, we did it in order to get reform made, that specifically in the runoff elections that were just held, that they had 2 representatives for each of the precincts observing the ballot. Are there improvements that actually could be made that might come out of this process?
I don't know about specifically coming out of this process, but there are certainly improvements that can be made to voting and election administration. One thing that we can expect to see is legislatures that are opposed to the idea that voters pick their representatives, and not the other way around. We can expect those legislatures to look to pass voting restrictions in upcoming sessions. So we have to fight against those attempts and what will be a coming backlash against young voters and against Black and brown voters having their say. But what we really need to do is to make our elections more resilient to last-minute emergencies by passing laws to make sure, for example, that voters can register up to and including on Election Day. We need to make sure that voting by mail is and continues to be accessible to all voters. We need to make it easier to register to vote, for example, by establishing online voter registration. And really put more protections into place that make sure that eligible voters aren't taken off the voter list through no fault of their own or by some idea of, use or lose as far as people's voting rights.
Michelle, you're a true student of the electoral process in this country, and I wonder what we've learned about the degree of resilience, to use your term, in the process. I go all the way back to 2000 and the Bush versus Gore contest, and when we looked at those few counties down in South Florida, it was pretty clear to everybody it didn't work very well. There were lots of problems, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, there were. It strikes me that with the overwhelming number of absentee ballots, early voting this time, much more than we've ever seen before, actually there were relatively few instances that I saw, at least, of real problems.
Absolutely. Being able to spread the voting out over a number of weeks and days makes our election officials more able to deal with election day issues and election day resources. So that's something that's been really helpful. I think election officials do need more funding to do what they've done, which is to uphold the law and to carry out the election really admirably under these circumstances, of course, particularly this year during the pandemic. And we need to support them in their work.
Finally, let me ask you the big question. Is there some chance here that the Republicans actually might ironically put the entire Electoral College process into question, something that would not benefit them if they eliminated the Electoral College tomorrow?
Again, this isn't an outcome-based scenario here. This is politics. I don't know that this specifically will be cause for changes on the Electoral College front. Certainly, there are movements and to focus more on the popular vote, which of course has Vice President Biden won as well. But I think it will certainly be interesting to see if that, as you say, ironic turn of events could occur.
Okay, Michelle, really appreciate you being with us. That was terrific. Michelle Cantor Cohen, she's senior counsel with the Fair Election Center. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for a market check and how those markets may be reacting to all the news coming out of both Georgia and Washington. Kaylee Lyons is here with a report. Kaylee?
Well, David, it seems to be that the market is pricing in a blue wave, and therefore the reflation trade is full steam ahead. You can see that evident in what is outperforming today. The likes of the Russell 2000 is higher by more than 4% at a fresh record high. It is, of course, cyclically sensitive, very sensitive to economic growth, and therefore the idea is it will benefit from what the market sees as a larger potential fiscal stimulus coming out of a Democratic Congress. On the flip side of the coin, you do have technology that is the laggard here. The NASDAQ 100 is down about 0.3% at the moment. The fear there is about regulation, also potentially higher corporate taxes. That is weighing on some of the mega cap tech stocks. The other big thing I'm watching in the market is, of course, the 10-year yield back above 1% for the first time since March, with an 8 basis point, almost 9 basis point move higher in today's session. And that move in yields, that steepening of the curve, is really benefiting a lot of the financial stocks. They are leading in today's session, the likes of Comerica up by double digits. Also, you're seeing some action investigation in the likes of EVs, in green energy, in construction, anything that could benefit from a green or potentially just more robust infrastructure spending. And of course, again, as I said, those tech stocks are really what's lagging, specifically those of the largest market cap. Facebook down 2%, Apple down more than 1% at this point, David.
So, Kaylee, I have to ask you at the dollar. How's the dollar holding up through all this?
So it's been interesting. It's fluctuated throughout the session. We did come into the day seeing pretty robust dollar weakness. It's hovering around its weakest since all the way back in the spring of 2018. It then flipped into positive territory. Right now, the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is basically flat. Of course, that really is a proxy for the kind of recovery trade. The thinking being that if you do get more stimulus, you do have yields moving higher. Maybe that is or is not good for the dollar. So the dollar has been whipsawing, but of course, it's very sensitive to the action we're really seeing in yields, as are other parts of the market. That is another story of tech, the thinking being higher yields will start to weigh on some of those big tech stocks when it comes to margins and really just the relative attractiveness, considering they enjoy such high valuations, David.
Yeah, there's also that little issue with China and the big tech and whether China might actually retaliate, right?
Yeah, especially when it comes to those telecoms. The NYSE making a U-turn to its U-turn. It is going to delist those 3 Chinese telecom companies, and you are seeing shares, those ADRs, down about 4% today, David.
You know, 180 one thing, a 360 something else entirely. Thanks so much to Kayla Lyons for that report on the markets. Still ahead, Sam Palmisano, former head of IBM, is here on what the elections mean for tech and what needs to be done about cybersecurity by the incoming Biden administration. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Big tech stocks are lagging the broader market today as they react to the prospect of Democrats taking both of the Senate seats in Georgia, raising questions about what a different and united Democratic government could mean for tech. Welcome now someone who knows tech like few others. He is Sam Palmisano, and he was the CEO of IBM. Sam, thank you so much for being back with us. We want to talk about cybersecurity, but first, give us your take. How much of a difference does it really make to the tech sector, particularly big tech, if in fact the Democrats have at least a 50-50 split with a tiebreaker in the Senate?
Yeah, David, we've talked about this in the past. I'll talk about a broader issue with tech, but let me start with the specific that you had mentioned. And thank you for having me, and Happy New Year. The specific is one of the few things that the two parties have agreed upon in the past several years is tech. And I'm not saying they have clarity on solution, but they have clarity that they must do something. And they've taken, I'll say, a big blood instrument to that called antitrust. I don't think that's the biggest societal issue, as you and I've talked about. I think it's really about the transparency, the uses of the data and privacy and those sorts of things. But it's kind of where we are, and they all sort of agree. I think with tech, the big tech companies would really want, quite honestly, out of the new administration, it's just really simple, just clarity. I mean that it sounds so simple, but it is so easy. Just clarity. Just tell us what you see the role of the United States within the global economy. Let us know what relationships you think are important with the like nations or our allies or those large economies that we might be competing with, but just establish some clarity along those lines, because it's not helpful to companies who have to allocate capital and invest resources in R&D and manufacturing, those sorts of things, what's constantly being disrupted. And we've had a lot of disruption. We had disruption with the tariffs. We've had disruption as with the pandemic. Now, having said all that, that doesn't mean that these companies, or if I was at IBM, we want a level playing field. We want the same playing field in the emerging countries or the developed countries like in Europe and Asia as they have in the United States. So open up competition and make it a level playing field.
Well, what about that, specifically with respect to Asia, specifically with respect to China? Because we now have new executive orders out of President Trump. It's not clear what a President-elect Biden would do about those. How big a threat or risk would that be for big tech, the rivalry in tech between China and the United States?
Well, China, think about the reason why the non-U.S. is so important to big tech is that's where the people are in the world. So therefore, that's where the people are. That's where the growth is. And that's where China is. Their economy is coming back. They're going to do quite well. So tech needs to participate in that growth, given the size of those companies and also the size of opportunities that exist. So that's fundamentally an imperative. Slapping executive orders back and forth to me is not an example of clarity. It's just confusion. Right. So, there's no reason not to insist that the U.S. should insist upon a level playing field. There are mechanisms within the international community. I know our current administration doesn't believe in any of those mechanisms like the WTO and all those sorts of things, but there are mechanisms to establish a level playing field. So I would somewhat argue that the Biden administration go back to how it always worked. And yeah, tough negotiations, that's fair. Argue for why it should be a level playing field, but slapping executive orders back and forth, it's sort of crazy. I mean, it really is. It just disrupts the economies. It disrupts people's ability to operate consistently over time. So that would be, I think, a very simple thing that they could do. Just come up with a strategy, state it, and let's all get behind it and support it.
Sam, there is another big tech issue on the agenda for the incoming Biden administration, and that is cybersecurity. As far as I'm concerned, we still don't know the full extent of the damage that might have been done or what was done with the Russian hack into government as well as big private computers here in the United States. What does the Biden administration need to do to move forward on this issue?
Well, I'd say that it's quite challenging for the Biden administration, quite honestly, David. I mean, there are two things at hand. One is they have to deal with the crisis. And you're right, we don't know exactly where we are, what happened, and that'll take time because the adversaries were very clever in how they approached the hack. And so therefore, they've hidden their fingerprints, so to speak, as we talk about. They're like mysteriously behind servers and the internet and those kinds of things, in layman's terms. So that's really, really important. I think on that regard, what do you do now, today, is you establish a commission, right, to look into the hack, which we know is through a supply chain, a small company providing services to the government as well as the other large companies in our economy called Solar Wind, and go to the root cause, come up with the definitions, what need to be done, and then obviously implement those. At the same time, there is some good news. In the NDAA, the National Defense Appropriations Act, they have put in place a Senate appointed position called the National Cyber Security Director, reporting into the White House. That's really, really important. We recommended that in the Obama Commission, that we felt that was important to have a focal point because of convening, right? So let's take the example I just mentioned, the current hack. You need to convene an interagency process to bring everyone together with all the skill sets, not leaving anyone out. You can't say, well, we don't want to talk to CISA because we're Homeland, and Homeland doesn't want to talk to NSA, or we don't want to talk to the private sector. You got to bring everybody involved in this process, including the private sector, to find out what is going on and what do we do about this particular crisis that we have at hand. So that's a very positive. The other reason it's a positive is because we really do need a strategy. We need a strategy that not only prevents this supply chain type of a hack that just occurred, but also what we need to do to protect our nation and our national defenses from adversaries from around the world.
So, Sam, one of the issues that we've talked about is whether, in fact, we've created some of the problem ourselves by really making it sort of an open season for tech in the United States. And a lot of tech companies have gone for profitability, for scope and scale, rather than security. Do we need to change that?
I think there has to be accountability in the system. So you have to have economic incentive that's balanced, right? If you think about it today, if you're a startup, a small company in tech, and therefore your goal is to go grow as fast as you can, innovate, have something very unique that is valued by your customers, innovate like crazy, but get to some large revenue base because you can either do an IPO or get acquired. That's the strategy. And look, I'm an investor in these tech startups. I mean, that is the strategy. In that strategy, things like cybersecurity and the things that you would put into your architecture have a lower priority than usability, i.e. the use of Zoom takes a higher priority than making it end-to-end encryption from a security perspective. That's just economics.
Sam, we have to get back together and talk about this again because I'm sorry, we're going to have to go back up to Capitol Hill because Mitch McConnell is talking. But thank you so much to Sam Palmisano, former CEO of IBM. And let's jump in now. The majority leader, Mitch McConnell, is addressing the Senate and condemning the move to challenge the Electoral College.
Republicans condemned those baseless efforts back then. And we just spent 4 years condemning Democrats' shameful attacks on the validity of President Trump's own election. So look, there can be no double standard. The media that is outraged today spent 4 years aiding and abetting Democrats' attacks on our institutions after they lost. But we must not imitate and escalate what we repudiate. Our duty is to govern for the public good. The United States Senate has a higher calling than an endless spiral of partisan vengeance. Congress will either override the voters, overrule them, the voters, the states, and the courts for the first time ever, or honor the people's decision. Will either guarantee Democrats' delegitimizing efforts after 2016 become a permanent new routine for both sides, or declare that our nation deserves a lot better than this. We'll either hasten down a poisonous path where only the winners of election actually accept the results, or show we can still muster the patriotic courage that our forebears showed not only in victory but in defeat. The framers built the Senate to stop short-term passions from boiling over and melting the foundations of our republic. So I believe protecting our constitutional order requires respecting the limits of our own power. It would be unfair and wrong to disenfranchise American voters and overrule the courts and the states on this extraordinarily thin basis. And I will not pretend such a vote would be a harmless protest gesture while relying on others to do the right thing. I will vote to respect the people's decision and defend our system of government as we know it.
Leader. We've been listening to the Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate, Mitch McConnell, as he addressed largely, it looked like, his Republican colleagues, to say that this is not a harmless protest gesture, that this is a fundamental issue that he cannot support, to object and challenge the wish of the voters. And now we're going to hear from the Minority Leader, who is Chuck Schumer.
Appointed on a bipartisan basis by the two houses to read to the Congress the results of an election that has already happened. We are here to receive an announcement of a vote that has already been certified by every state in the Union and confirmed by the courts many times over. We're here to watch the current Vice President open envelopes and receive the news of a verdict that has already been rendered. It is a solemn and august occasion, no doubt, but it is a formality. The Congress does not determine the outcome of elections, the people do. The Congress is not endowed with the power to administer elections. Our states are given that power. By the end of the proceedings today, it will be confirmed once again something that is well known and well settled. The American people elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to be the next president and vice president of the United States. And yet, a number of our colleagues have organized an effort to undermine and object to that free and fair election. They're in the minority. They will lose. They know that. They have no evidence of widespread voter fraud upon which to base their objections. That's because there is none. There is none. Not brought before any of the courts successfully. They know that President Trump and his allies have suffered a defeat in court after court across the country, losing no fewer than 62 legal challenges. And I might add, many Republican-appointed judges, some appointed by President Trump, rendered those decisions. They know, you all know, that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to be sworn in as President and Vice President of the United States on January 20th. But they are going to object to the counting of the vote anyway. And in the process, they will embarrass themselves, they will embarrass their party, and worst of all, they will embarrass their country. This insurrection was fortunately discouraged by the leadership of the majority party, but it was not quelled. It is a very sad comment on our times that merely the accepting the results of an election is considered an act of political courage. Sadder and more dangerous still is the fact that an element of the Republican Party believes their political viability hinges on the endorsement of an attempted coup. That anyone, much less an elected official, would be willing to tarnish our democracy in order to burnish their personal political fortunes. Over the course of the afternoon, and however far into the evening this band of Republican objectors wants to take us, senators of goodwill from both sides of the aisle will explain why these challenges must be dismissed. The senators from states whose electoral votes are being challenged will explain how the allegations of fraud are baseless. And a substantial bipartisan majority must vote to put down these objections and defend the sanctity of our elections and indeed, our great and grand democracy. Because that's what we're talking about today. The health of our democracy. This wonderful, beautiful, grand democracy where the peaceful passing of the torch is extolled by school children in the second grade, but not by some here. As we speak, half of our voters are being conditioned by the outgoing president to believe that when his party loses an election, the results must not be legitimate. As we speak, the eyes of the world are on this chamber, questioning whether America is still the shining example of democracy, the shining city on the hill. What message we send today? What message will we send today to our people, to the world that has so looked up to us for centuries? What message will we send to fledgling democracies who study our Constitution, mirror our laws and traditions, in the hopes that they too can build a country ruled by the consent of the governed? What message will we send to those countries where democratic values are under assault and look to us to see if those values are still worth fighting for? What message will we send to every dark corner of the world where human rights are betrayed, elections are stolen, human dignity denied? What will we show those people? Will we show those people that there is a better way to ensure liberty and opportunity of humankind? Sadly, a small band of Republican objectors may darken the view of our democracy today, but a larger group of senators and House members from both sides of the aisle can send a message too. That democracy beats deep in the hearts of our citizens and our elected representatives, that we are a country of laws and of not men, that our traditions are not so easily discarded, even by our president, that facts matter, that truth matters, that while democracy allows free speech and free expression, even if that expression is anti-democratic, there will always, always be, praise God, a far broader and stronger coalition ready to push back and defend everything we hold dear. We can send that message today by voting in large and overwhelming numbers to defeat these objections. My colleagues, We each swore an oath just 3 days ago that we would defend and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that we would bear true faith and allegiance to the same. We swore that we took this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that we could well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office we were about to enter, so help us God. The precise words of that oath were shortly written after the Civil War, when the idea of true faith and allegiance to this country and its Constitution took on enormous meaning. Let those words ring in the ears of every senator today. Let us do our duty to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help us God.
We have been listening to the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, senator from the state of New York, give his remarks as part of the 2-hour debate in the Senate chamber on the objection lodged to the certification of the electoral count vote from the state of Arizona. He followed the majority leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, and perhaps in one of the rare occasions when they were in raging agreement, both speakers in different ways decried the notion that there would be challenges to these electoral college votes. We now have the senator who supported the objection, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas.
Certitude and a bit more recognition that we are gathered at a time when democracy is in crisis. Recent polling shows that 39% of Americans believe the election that just occurred, quote, was rigged. You may not agree with that assessment, but it is nonetheless a reality for nearly half the country. I would note it is not just Republicans who believe that. 31% of independents agree with that statement. 17% of Democrats believe the election was rigged. Even if you do not share that conviction, it is the responsibility, I believe, of this office to acknowledge that is a profound threat to this country and to the legitimacy of any administrations that will come in the future. I want to take a moment to speak to my Democratic colleagues. I understand your guy is winning right now. If Democrats vote as a bloc, Joe Biden will almost certainly be certified as the next president of the United States. I want to speak to the Republicans who are considering voting against these objections. I understand your concerns, but I urge you to pause and think. What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims of illegality and fraud in this election? And I believe there's a better way. The leaders just spoke about setting aside the election. Let me be clear, I am not arguing for setting aside the result of this election. All of us are faced with two choices, both of which are lousy. One choice is vote against the objection. And tens of millions of Americans will see a vote against the objection as a statement that voter fraud doesn't matter, isn't real, and shouldn't be taken seriously. And a great many of us don't believe that. On the other hand, most, if not all of us, believe we should not set aside the results of an election just because our candidate may not have prevailed. And so I endeavored to look for door number 3, a third option, and for that I looked to history, to the precedent of the 1876 election, the Hayes-Tilden election, where this Congress appointed an electoral commission to examine claims of voter fraud. 5 House members, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices examined the evidence and rendered a judgment. And what I would urge of this body is that we do the same. That we appoint an electoral commission to conduct a 10-day emergency audit, consider the evidence, and resolve the claims. For those on the Democratic aisle who say there is no evidence, they've been rejected, then you should rest in comfort. If that's the case, an electoral commission would reject those claims. But for those who respect the voters, simply telling the voters, go jump in a lake, the fact that you have deep concerns is of no moment to us. That jeopardizes, I believe, the legitimacy of this and subsequent elections. The Constitution gives to Congress the responsibility this day to count the votes. The framers knew what they were doing when they gave responsibilities to Congress. We have a responsibility, and I would urge that we follow the precedent of 1877. The Electoral Count Act explicitly allows objections such as this one for votes that were not regularly given. And let me be clear, this objection is for the state of Arizona, but it is broader than that. It is an objection for all 6 of the contested states to have a credible, objective, impartial body hear the evidence and make a conclusive determination. That would benefit both sides. That would improve legitimacy of this election. And so let me urge my colleagues, all of us take our responsibility seriously. I would urge my colleagues, don't take perhaps the easy path, but instead act together, astonish the viewers, and act in a bipartisan sense to say we will have a credible and fair tribunal, consider the claims, consider the facts, consider the evidence, and make a conclusive determination whether and to what extent this election complied with the Constitution and with federal law.
And that has been Senator Ted Cruz of the state of Texas presenting his argument in support of the objection that he helped lodge. This followed after the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and then the Minority Leader Chuck Schumer both gave speeches saying that it was not the right way to go, that it was not consistent with the Constitution or the laws of the United States for them to challenge the will of the people as expressed through the Electoral College. In the meantime, I want to bring you up to speed also on another developing story related to this, perhaps. There are demonstrators. It's hard to know exactly how many. Some of them are scattered, some of them in more concentrated groups, who are demonstrating in Washington, in and around Capitol Hill. There are reports that at least the Cannon House office building has been evacuated because of concerns. And so there are demonstrations going on. Hard to know, as I say, how many people are demonstrating. We have no reports so far, at least, of any violence involved with that. But that's what's going on. Let's bring in now, to wrap this all up, if he can, Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent. So, Kevin, go back to the speeches we've just heard in the Senate. What do you make of them?
The process is playing out. And what you heard from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and then in a speech from Senator Ted Cruz was all 3 of these senators working the process. And so the process is outlined by the Constitution and outlined by the framers is being adhered to, with the president of the Senate, Vice President Mike Pence, presiding. And I mention that because as of now, there have been no major separations from that process. And I think that's incredibly important to note as we cover this.
The process seems to be working. Thank you so much to Kevin Cirilli. Stay with Bloomberg Television and Radio as this story continues to develop. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.